Japan is rearming. Quietly. And China is watching closely, Japan's martial metamorphosis, and the quiet end of its post-war exceptionalism. For almost 80 years, Japan followed one rule: never become a military power again. That rule is now breaking, quietly, without rewriting its constitution. Japan has started exporting weapons, expanding its defense industry, and preparing for a world where America may no longer guarantee its security. And China has noticed. This may be the biggest strategic shift in Asia since the end of World War II. For 8 decades, Japan's pacifism functioned less as a legal arrangement than as a national theology. Article 9 of its constitution, drafted under American occupation in the ruins of imperial defeat, was not merely a constraint on military behavior. It was a story the country talked about itself, that prosperity could replace power, that commerce could substitute for coercion, and that alliance could stand in for autonomy. Japan would be rich, dependable, and restrained. Others would manage the unpleasant business of deterrence. That story is now being rewritten. Under the administration of Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, Tokyo has undertaken what may prove the most consequential shift in its strategic posture since the end of the Second World War. By dismantling long-standing restrictions on defense exports, Japan has begun transforming itself from a protected consumer of American security into a supplier of military capability. This is not a constitutional revision in name. It is a constitutional revision in practice. The peace state has not disappeared. But it has unmistakably evolved. From constitutional restraint to strategic autonomy, Japan's post-war settlement rested on an elegant bargain. Washington guaranteed security, Tokyo delivered economic growth. In exchange for hosting American bases and aligning with American strategy, Japan gained access to global markets and freedom from the burdens of great power competition. The arrangement suited both parties. It also suited Japan's electorate, which came to see military restraint not as a concession to defeat but as a moral achievement. Yet strategic bargains age. The removal of the so-called 5 categories restricting defense exports marks the clearest signal, yet that Tokyo no longer regards self-limitation as a permanent virtue. For decades, Japan's defense industry was confined to supplying its own self-defense forces with non-exportable systems, technologically impressive, economically inefficient, and strategically inward-looking. The new framework changes that calculus entirely. Japan is preparing to enter the global arms market not as a marginal player but as a high-end supplier. This shift does not abolish Article 9. Instead, it quietly empties it of its original political meaning. Japan is no longer defining itself primarily by what it refuses to do. It is beginning to define itself by what it must be able to do. That distinction matters. The erosion of the American umbrella, the most immediate driver of Japan's transformation, lies not in Tokyo but in Washington. For generations, Japanese policymakers treated the American alliance as an invariant fact of international life. The United States might quarrel with allies over trade, complain about burden sharing, or shift its rhetorical tone, but it would remain the ultimate guarantor of regional order. That assumption is now under strain. America's defense industrial base is stretched by commitments in Europe and the Middle East. Its political system is increasingly volatile. And the prospect of a second Trump administration has introduced an unfamiliar variable into alliance planning: conditional security guarantees. Tokyo is not panicking. It is hedging. Prime Minister Takaichi's observation that no nation can maintain its peace alone sounds banal. In Japanese political language, however, it marks a quiet revolution. It signals a departure from the post-1970s consensus that Japan could outsource risk indefinitely. Instead, Japan is preparing for a world in which alliance reliability must be supplemented by national capability. Strategic autonomy, once a European slogan, has found a new audience in East Asia. The industrial logic of rearmament, grand strategy, often disguises itself as economics. In Japan's case, the disguise is thin. For decades, the country's defense manufacturers, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Kawasaki Heavy Industries, and IHI among them, ran under conditions that would have crippled almost any Western competitor. Limited production runs inflated costs. Export prohibitions prevented scale. Innovation depended on a single domestic customer with predictable procurement cycles and limited appetite for experimentation. Opening export channels changes everything. Larger production volumes reduce per-unit costs. International competition accelerates technological improvement. Foreign partnerships spread development risk across multiple buyers. Export capacity ensures that production lines remain active during peacetime, an advantage that becomes decisive in crisis. Japan's defense reforms are therefore not simply geopolitical. They are industrial policy by other means. In an era of contested supply chains and fragile logistics, the ability to manufacture complex systems domestically is no longer optional. It is sovereign insurance, equipment, diplomacy, and the geometry of influence. Weapons exports are never just commercial transactions. They are instruments of alignment. When Japan supplies radar systems to Southeast Asia or maritime platforms to European partners, it creates relationships that extend far beyond procurement contracts. Training programs, maintenance agreements, interoperability standards, and intelligence sharing arrangements follow naturally. Over time, these networks form a lattice of strategic dependence. This is equipment diplomacy in its purest form. Consider the Philippines, which faces mounting pressure in the South China Sea. Japanese patrol vessels and surveillance systems do more than enhance Manila's maritime awareness. They anchor the country more firmly within a coalition of states resisting Chinese coercion. Or consider Poland, whose search for technologically sophisticated alternatives to traditional suppliers reflects a broader European diversification of defense partnerships. Japan's entry into the export market therefore alters the geography of influence. It extends Tokyo's strategic reach from the Baltic to the Western Pacific without requiring permanent deployments or treaty revisions. Hardware becomes diplomacy by proxy. For a country long accustomed to exercising power through development aid and trade agreements, this is a notable evolution. China's predictable alarm and rational concern. Beijing's response has been swift and hostile. Official commentary has denounced Japan's policy shift as evidence of resurgent militarism. Such rhetoric is familiar. It is also revealing. China's objections are not merely historical. They are structural. A Japan capable of exporting advanced military technology complicates Beijing's efforts to reshape the regional balance of power. It strengthens the defensive capacities of states along the First Island chain. It reinforces American alliance networks. And it introduces a technologically sophisticated competitor into markets where China has looked to expand its own influence. From Beijing's perspective, Japan's transformation is less about the past than about the future. A passive Japan could be accommodated. An active Japan must be countered. The domestic constraint, memory versus necessity. If China presents the most visible external challenge to Japan's defense reforms, public opinion represents the most persistent internal one. Half the Japanese electorate stays skeptical of expanded arms exports. For many citizens, the notion of made-in-Japan weaponry circulating globally sits uneasily with the country's post-war identity. Pacifism is not merely constitutional language. It is a social memory. This tension is unlikely to disappear quickly. Japan's political leadership is therefore engaged in a delicate balancing act, expanding strategic capacity without provoking domestic backlash. Rather than pursuing dramatic constitutional revision, policymakers have chosen incremental reinterpretation. Rather than declaring a new military doctrine, they have adjusted procurement rules. The result is transformation without spectacle. It is also a transformation without consensus. The return of normality. For decades analysts described Japan as an abnormal power, economically formidable, technologically advanced, and politically stable, yet strategically constrained. That description is becoming obsolete. Japan is not abandoning pacifism entirely. Nor is it seeking regional dominance. Instead, it is converging toward the behavior expected of a mature industrial democracy found in a contested neighborhood. It is building alliances, strengthening deterrence, and supporting partners through capability transfers. In short, it is becoming normal. This normality has consequences. A Japan that exports defense equipment increases the resilience of coalition networks across Asia and Europe. It complicates unilateral attempts to revise territorial status. And it reduces reliance on a single security guarantor whose domestic politics have grown increasingly unpredictable. At the same time, it raises expectations. Allies will look to Tokyo for leadership as well as logistics. Partners will expect continuity as well as capability. Strategic autonomy, once embraced, rarely allows retreat. The quiet transformation of the balance of power, the most significant feature of Japan's policy shift, is not its symbolism but its timing. It arrives at a moment when the international order appears unusually brittle. Russia stays engaged in prolonged war in Europe, the Middle East continues to generate strategic shocks. And the Indo-Pacific is emerging as the primary theater of great power competition. In such an environment, even modest adjustments by major economies carry disproportionate weight. Japan's decision to move from shield to supplier therefore alters more than its own posture. It reshapes expectations across the alliance system. It signals to smaller states that technological alternatives to American hardware exist. And it reminds China that regional balancing behavior is accelerating rather than receding. The rising sun is not returning to the ambitions of the early 20th century. But neither is it content with the passivity of the late 20th century. Instead, it is adapting, quietly, methodically and with characteristic caution, to the strategic realities of the 21st. The Constitution still speaks the language of peace. The shipyards and laboratories increasingly speak the language of power. The world will have to learn to listen to both.